Hi all, welcome to our Data MythBusters series, a series towards assisting the organization to become more data driven and get rid of all data myths. I'm your host Drishti Dubey. So today we have our data expert Mahesh Hegde, who is the Associate VP and leads Data and Insights Delivery for a Fortune 100 enterprise client, who will be busting all the myths about data migration. Welcome Mahesh.
Thanks, Drishti. I'm glad to be part of this discussion. Hello, all.
So, first of all, we hear so much about data migration when it comes to digital transformation. How long does it usually take to migrate data?
Right. I think it's an important question in the overall migration process itself. But the actual answer to it depends on number of factors, and it could that's why be very different from one scenario to the other scenario. Let me explain why. Right. So for one thing, right? If the volumes are huge, the kind of transfer mechanism that you use for migration is limited. It is going to take longer, and it's in a way math of it. But that's just the actual calculation of the transfer time. Now there are other bigger factors to it that needs to be definitely considered while you kind of estimate the overall timelines for the entire data migration process, as well as for the entire the environment or the infrastructure migration process, which data migration is going to be part of. So one of the things, for example, is the nature of the migration itself. If you do a lift and shift, which is sort of replicating your current infrastructure setup onto another environment, let's say on the cloud, versus you are undertaking also a transformation process in your migration. Those are going to be two different types of migration, and the time involved in those two are going to be very different. Your transformation process is going to take much longer. Other point is, or the other factor is the scale of migration. The size of the infrastructure you're talking about, whether you're doing some specific components of the infrastructure or the IT landscape versus entire landscape migration. Now, obviously, other things like the complexity, the applications or systems dependencies, there could be process changes involved, people readiness aspects and adoption and support and so on. So I think the overall migration timeline will depend on such factors, and most likely it will be done in phases and sprints.
So, why data migration cannot be done all at once?
I think it's not impossible, but in most cases, I would say it's either not viable or a best choice. Because I think, there could be some exceptional situations. Let's say there is a time-sensitive goal that you need to retire an existing infrastructure for whatever reasons, right? It could be contractual reasons that you need to retire your existing on-premises data center, or you need to retire a part of it. Or there are some legal or other grounds based on which you really have to move fast, then maybe you can do it all at once and then take your journey forward from there, from what I was referring to as a lift and shift, where you replicate your current setup into a new environment, and from there you continue your transformation journey within the cloud. But except from such situation, I think it's not going to be the case that you do all data migration at once, because as I said, the overall migration journey itself is likely to happen over, let's say, a few months or even quarters or years. and you need to align the data migration to that. Every phase of the migration will involve corresponding data migration typically. So I think that's one of the key reasons why you can't really do all at once data migration in most cases, Drishti.
Okay. So could you tell us about those scenarios and why would phased migration be a better choice?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a number of situations. For example, your organization readiness might not be there, that because of which you want to do the migration gradually, incrementally. It could be the fact that you have invested quite heavily in the current infrastructure that you want to leverage for the coming years. So you consider a hybrid model to be a best choice. Or it could be that there is some compliance, clearance, or approvals needed, and you can't migrate some other things by then. So you want to go with phased migration. That could be flight projects, critical org changes that are preventing the funding situation, and so on. So maybe I'll give you an example, maybe another example, right? Let's say your enterprise has hundreds of applications, and you have a vision to modernize them, and the next generation application will be run in cloud, and it will be built a cloud native application in their next versions. Now, it's not very practical to modernize all the applications at once so that you can do one-time data migration to the cloud. So what will end up happening is that you will probably select a few and less complex applications, and you bring the relevant sample data from the current environment to the cloud. That will include some reference data or a master data, other application data that this app requires, and this application's data itself for the development purpose, right? And then you build the application, you use some realistic data, copy it over from the current environment, and do the testing. And then when it is time for go live in production for this application in question, you would do the full production data migration. And in many cases, you still need to keep some overlapping window between current production application and the new application. So that's a window of synchronization of data between the two systems until you have fully retired your previous production application. And then of course, once you move it, there may be some additional replications of data or security setup or backup process, etc. So that's sort of for a given application itself, there is a phased migration involved.
So can this be considered one-time migration of production data and some pre-production replications?
Not really. I mean, for one application, it would appear like that. But remember, though, that this is one of the hundreds of applications we are talking about. So you still have to migrate those remaining applications. And now what happens is that you might have migrated a few. So they are producing data in the cloud, and there are some still continue to run in on-premises environment. So there is most likely a need for data exchange between those, whether it is continuous or periodic. There would be need for copying some reference data between the two environments or multiple environments. And as you start moving more and more applications to the cloud, the whole migration scenario has changed. So it requires a continuous evolution of the data migration process, to call it. And some applications may never get migrated because of either some of the compliance reasons, or just simply because there is no benefit in moving them over to the new infrastructure. So there will be a continued need for some form of a sync or replication, um, if you call it not a migration truly. But I think that's not bad though, right? Because it's a choice that you're making considering number of factors involved.
So, with all the complexities that are associated with the migration and the interruptions to business continuity, do you think it is worth investing in migration rather than into existing infrastructure?
Good question, Dristy. I think that's definitely a first question one would ask from a business perspective. Is it worth the investment? Is the change worth it? Is the risk worth it? But I think in most cases, um, the benefits really outweigh the cost and the risk of the migration. See, there are some of the things that if you consider on-premise to cloud, for example, right? I'm not talking about maybe cloud to cloud. There are some comparable explanations as well. But if you take example of on-premise to cloud migration, there are several advantages that you don't want to miss out typically. For example, the amount of upfront investments that you have to do in your own infrastructure versus the cloud providing a pay-as-you-go model where you can incrementally build and use on the need basis the kind of scalability, resiliency that the cloud provides, the cost efficiency you get because of the what we call economies of scale in the large public cloud, and also you use the resources maybe a few hours in a day, and you get charged only for that, only for the resources that you use, not the underlying overall hardware infrastructure, for example, right? The kind of global reach or the global presence they provide, the agility, elasticity, there are much more. So it's typically not possible for organizations to achieve similar levels by themselves with their own infrastructure, right? So I think then there are some examples where the kind of local caching and setting up data residency, etc. You can't really achieve them all by yourself. So in fact, in some of these cases, you can even use cloud as an extended infrastructure to your own infrastructure.
Any recommendations or best practices with respect to phased migration and specifically the data migration?
Sure, I think a few to call out. There are some standards and frameworks and best practices provided by the industry, by the cloud service providers, but some quick recall types. One critical thing is to understand and document the objectives behind this migration effort. That really help bring clarity in every step among every stakeholders involved, and keep that current because your priorities will keep changing, especially when the time frame of migration is big. Secondly, I would say evaluate each options for every component involved. It's not that one strategy fits everything. For example, there are options to replace big system with a third party, or there are options another small tool or an app that can be rebuilt. The cost involved, the complexity involved, etc. If you do it at a granular level, that's really going to be helpful. Journey maps for the to-be state, the intermediate state, and the final state will help bring the clarity of the user experience and organizational process experience. Develop the right principles and policies. It's important not only during the migration but also the success post-migration, so that they help really avoid the bottlenecks, bring in the governance, self-governance in place. Data architectures for the current to be state and the interim states is important. The data ownership is as important as having an application or a product ownership for that matter. Then, of course, the kind of checklists that you need to have in place pre-migration, during migration, and the post-migration activities. And this should evolve, basically, if there are learnings and feedback or recommendations by the stakeholders, ensure that that gets incorporated into the checklist so that you improve from phase 1 to phase 2 and so on.
Thank you so much, Mahesh, for your valuable input. This brings us to the end of the podcast. Thank you all for listening. I look forward to hearing your comments and feedback. Do join us for the next Mythbuster. Stay tuned. And if you have any doubts, please reach us on Azure Help Desk. Thank you.
Thank you, Rishi. Thank you all.